The first thing that made me uneasy wasn't the abandoned lodge. It wasn't the claw marks on the door. It wasn't even the fact that my campfire had been put out while I was gone. It was the sound. A quiet, broken laugh drifting through the trees. Not loud enough to reveal where it came from, but close enough to let me know I wasn't alone anymore. And whoever was out there was enjoying watching me panic. This happened back in the summer of 2018, when I was 23. I had driven down to Vermont to stay with family for a few weeks and clear my head. My parents' place sat just outside the Appalachian foothills, surrounded by thick forest and long stretches of empty back roads. When I still lived there, I used to hike and camp constantly. After moving away for work, I barely had time anymore. So this trip felt like a chance to reconnect with something familiar and grounding. There was one spot I'd been thinking about for a long time. A few months earlier, I'd stumbled across a small forum thread where people shared locations of forgotten structures hidden in the woods. Abandoned cabins, collapsed lodges, old ranger stations. Buried in the comments was a vague mention of a trail that supposedly led to an old logging lodge deep in the forest, several miles from the nearest road. No photos, no exact coordinates, just scattered directions and a few cryptic comments warning that the path was overgrown and rarely traveled. That alone made it tempting. So early one Monday morning, I packed my gear, filled the car with gas, and drove out toward the area. There were no trail signs, no parking lot, just a narrow shoulder along a quiet road where the tree line opened slightly. I pulled over, locked the car, and stepped into the woods. The trail barely deserved the name. It looked like nothing more than a faint break in the weeds and branches, carved out over time by curious explorers. Thick brush leaned inward, scraping against my arms and backpack. Fallen branches forced me to step carefully. It felt like the forest was slowly reclaiming whatever path had once existed. The hike took just under 2 hours, mostly flat, but exhausting due to the constant obstacles and uneven ground. Eventually, the trees thinned, and there it was. The lodge sat crooked and half swallowed by vines and moss, like the forest had been patiently eating it alive. Large portions of the roof had collapsed inward. Thick green growth wrapped around the logs. Dark stains streaked down the wood where rainwater had seeped in for decades. From a distance, it looked less like a building and more like a rotting skeleton. My original plan had been to camp inside the structure, stupid in hindsight. But one glance up close killed that idea immediately. The place was unstable. Mold coated the walls. The air smelled damp and sour, like wet wood and decay. The front door stood wide open. I leaned inside cautiously, shining my flashlight into the interior. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. Sections of ceiling had fallen in. Everything felt wrong. Unsafe, heavy, oppressive. At the far end of the main hallway, I noticed one intact door still standing upright, strangely untouched compared to everything else. For a moment, I considered trying to reach it, curiosity pulling at me. But the floorboards sagged too much. One bad step could have sent me crashing through rotten wood. I backed out. With daylight already beginning to fade, I decided to set up camp nearby instead. I walked about 200 feet away from the lodge, found a small clearing between trees, and pitched my tent. I gathered fallen branches, built a modest fire, and tried to settle into the quiet rhythm of the woods. As the sun sank lower, shadows stretched longer between the trees. The outline of the lodge slowly vanished into darkness until I could no longer see it at all. Birds faded. Wind softened. The forest transitioned into that deep nighttime hush where every small sound suddenly feels magnified. I sat by the fire, tossing sticks into the flames, letting my mind wander. That's when I heard it. At first, I couldn't even identify the sound. It was loud, sharp, like heavy wood bending or splitting under pressure. A low groan followed by a dull crack. The sound came from the direction of the lodge. It only lasted a few seconds, but it sent a cold ripple through my chest. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Collapsing beams, shifting debris, old wood reacting to temperature changes. Still, something about it didn't feel natural. I listened carefully for another half hour. Nothing. The woods stayed quiet, but the unease didn't fade. I knew if I didn't investigate, my imagination would spiral all night. So I added more wood to the fire to keep it burning, grabbed my small LED lantern, and headed back toward the lodge. It appeared slowly in the beam of light as I approached, darker, more distorted than before. The broken windows looked like hollow eye sockets. The vines cast twisting shadows across the walls. When I reached the front, I froze. The door was closed. I was absolutely certain it had been wide open earlier. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. That's when I noticed the marks. Deep scratches carved across the front of the door. Long, uneven gouges in the wood, like something sharp had dragged against it repeatedly. They weren't subtle. They were fresh enough that lighter wood showed beneath the surface. I hadn't seen those earlier. I tried to convince myself they had always been there and I simply missed them. But the memory didn't sit right. Something else felt wrong. I reached for the handle. It wouldn't move. Not stuck, not jammed. It felt like someone, or something, was physically holding it shut from the other side. A sudden wave of panic rushed through me. I didn't test it again. I backed away slowly, turned, and headed straight back toward my campsite. That's when the next problem hit me. The forest was completely dark. My campfire, the only real light source, was gone. Only my lantern illuminated the trees ahead. My pace quickened as I followed the faint memory of the path. Branches snagged my clothes. Leaves crunched too loudly under my boots. My pulse hammered in my ears. When I finally reached the clearing, a thin column of smoke drifted upward where my fire had been. Someone had put it out. Recently. I stood frozen, sweeping the lantern light across the trees. No movement, no voices. Just smoke curling into the dark air. A deep, crawling dread settled into my stomach. And that's when I heard it. A soft laugh. Not loud, not aggressive, just amused. Coming from somewhere beyond the trees. The sound was faint, almost playful. Not a full laugh. More like someone quietly enjoying a private joke they didn't want anyone else to hear. It came from somewhere beyond the edge of the lantern's glow. My skin prickled instantly. I stood perfectly still, holding the light out in front of me, scanning the trees in slow, careful arcs. Every shadow seemed deeper now. Every branch looked like it could be hiding something just beyond reach. "Hello?" I called out, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. No answer. Only the faint crackle of dying embers beneath the thin layer of ash where my fire had been smothered. I swallowed hard. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. Immediately. The hike back to the car would take about 2 hours, even at a fast pace. Normally, that wouldn't bother me. But doing it at night, with limited visibility, and whatever that sound belonged to somewhere in the woods, made my chest tighten with anxiety. Still, staying here felt worse. I moved quickly, tearing down my tent with shaking hands. Poles snapped free too loudly. Fabric scraped against branches. I stuffed everything into my backpack without bothering to organize it. A few small items slipped into the dirt, but I didn't stop to retrieve them. Another soft laugh floated through the trees. Closer this time. My breath caught. I slung the pack over my shoulders and rushed toward the direction I believed the trail was in. The lantern's beam bounced wildly as I moved, barely illuminating the uneven ground ahead. Roots grabbed at my boots. Low branches slapped against my arms and face. Several times, I stopped abruptly, convinced I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, careful steps matching my pauses. Every time I turned around, there was nothing. Just darkness swallowing the light. The forest felt wrong now. Not empty, occupied. I kept moving. My pulse pounded so hard it felt like it might drown out everything else. My ears strained constantly for any change in sound. Twigs snapping, leaves shifting, breath that wasn't mine. Then I heard it again. That same low laugh. Off to my right this time. I spun the lantern toward it, heart hammering, but the beam only revealed tangled brush and black trunks fading into darkness. Whoever it was, they were staying just outside the light, watching. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through my body. I broke into a near jog, doing my best to stay on what little of the path I could still recognize. The lantern flickered slightly as my grip tightened around it. Minutes stretched endlessly. My breathing burned in my chest. Sweat dampened my collar despite the cool night air. My legs started to ache, but fear pushed me forward. Every so often I'd hear faint movement, never enough to pinpoint, just enough to keep my nerves stretched to the breaking point. I never once saw anyone. That was somehow worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees began thinning slightly. The ground flattened out. I recognized the shape of the roadside shoulder ahead. Relief surged through me so hard my knees almost buckled. I burst out of the tree line and stumbled toward my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, locking the doors instantly. The headlights cut through the darkness as I started the engine. For a split second, I considered scanning the edge of the woods. I didn't. Some part of me knew that whatever had been following me didn't need to reveal itself anymore. I peeled away from the shoulder and drove. I didn't slow down until the forest had completely disappeared in my rearview mirror and the road lights of the nearest town came into view. Even then, my heart didn't calm. That night replayed in my head endlessly for weeks afterward. The closed door, the fresh scratches, the extinguished fire, the laughter. I still don't know who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was some unstable squatter living inside that collapsed lodge. Maybe it was someone deliberately stalking hikers for their own twisted entertainment. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is this: I've never gone back to that forest, and I never will. Because whatever was out there that night didn't feel like it wanted to scare me away. It felt like it was learning how I reacted. Next story. I didn't realize something had been watching us long before I ever saw it. Not when the forest went quiet. Not when my dog refused to leave my side. Not even when I felt that crawling pressure between my shoulder blades, like unseen eyes following every move I made. I realized it only when I opened my tent, and the beam of my flashlight landed on a man standing 10 feet away, holding a knife. Last summer, I went backpacking with my dog, Rocky. Rocky's an Australian shepherd, smart, fast, fearless when he needs to be. He's been on dozens of hikes and camping trips with me over the years. Trails, mountains, remote forests. None of it ever bothered him. He loved the freedom, the smells, the endless space to explore. That's why this trip felt routine. The campsite we were heading to was one I'd visited several times before. It was deep along the trail, about an 8-hour hike, tucked into a quiet pocket of forest that almost no one ever visited. No crowds, no noise, just trees in every direction and a small clearing where I usually set up camp. Rocky always loved that place because I could let him roam off-leash without worrying about other hikers. We reached the clearing just before sunset. The spot itself wasn't beautiful in any dramatic way. No lake, no overlook, no mountains in the distance. Just a circle of dirt and pine needles surrounded by tall trees, their branches locking together overhead like a dark ceiling. I found it peaceful, safe. I dropped my pack and started setting up the tent while Rocky did what he always did, a quick patrol of the area. He trotted a short distance into the trees, sniffing around, checking scents, then disappeared briefly behind the brush. I didn't think much of it. About 15 minutes later, he came back. But something was wrong. His tail was low, his ears were angled back. He walked straight up to me, pressed close against my leg, then turned and stared into the woods behind him. Rocky never acted like that, not during storms, not around wildlife, not even when unfamiliar people passed by on trails. This was different. I stood up and followed his gaze, scanning the tree line. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just shadows layered on top of shadows. I checked him over, thinking maybe he'd stepped on something sharp or twisted a paw. He was completely fine physically, no limping, no injuries, just tense, alert, watching. That unsettled me more than if I'd actually seen something. As I finished setting up camp and started building the fire, Rocky refused to leave my side. He didn't wander, didn't sniff around, didn't explore. He stayed glued to my leg, eyes locked on the woods like he was tracking something invisible. Every time I glanced into the trees, I felt it too. That strange sensation, like the forest was staring back. I tried convincing myself it was just nerves. Maybe Rocky had caught the scent of a deer or some small animal moving through earlier. Dogs pick up on things humans can't. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops and the shadows swallowed the clearing, my unease had only grown stronger. The fire crackled softly, throwing weak orange light across the dirt. Beyond the ring of light, the woods dissolved into solid black. Normally, nights out there felt calming. That night didn't. About an hour after dark, Rocky suddenly froze. His head snapped up. His body stiffened. His ears stood straight, and his tail tucked tightly under him. He stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, completely locked in. A low, anxious whine slipped out of his throat. My stomach tightened. I followed his stare, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond maybe 20 feet. The trees looked like solid walls of shadow. Nothing moved, nothing reflected light. Rocky began quietly trembling. That's when I knew something was truly wrong. Trusting his instincts, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly pointed it toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow tunnel, bouncing off trunks and low branches. Nothing. I took a few cautious steps forward, Rocky glued to my side. 50 feet out, still nothing. No animals, no glowing eyes, no sound of movement. We returned to the fire, but my nerves didn't settle. Rocky stayed hyper-alert the rest of the evening, constantly shifting positions and scanning the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion caught up to both of us. We climbed into the tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. Rocky curled up beside me but stayed tense for a long time before finally drifting off. I followed not long after. That's when the dream started. I was walking alone through the woods at night. No trail, no Rocky. Just endless trees and darkness. Somewhere ahead, a high-pitched sound kept repeating, faint at first, then louder, over and over, like something calling out. The sound pierced straight through my skull. And then I woke up. Rocky was nudging my face urgently, whining in my ear, making the exact same high-pitched noise from my dream. My heart immediately started racing. He'd been trying to wake me. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and slowly unzipped the tent. The cool night air rushed in. I stepped out and switched on the light. And that's when I saw him. A man stood barely 10 feet from the tent, dressed entirely in black, a hood pulled low over his face, only part of a dark beard visible beneath the shadow. In his hand, something reflected the beam of my flashlight. Metal, a knife. Both of us froze. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then the man shifted his weight forward. Rocky let out a deep, violent growl. The growl didn't sound like Rocky. Not the playful warning he used when strangers walked too close on trails. Not the excited bark he made when he wanted to chase something. This was deep, low, dangerous, pure instinct. The man hesitated. For the first time since the flashlight beam caught him, I saw uncertainty flicker through his posture. His shoulders tightened slightly, his grip on the knife shifting. Rocky stepped forward, placing himself directly between us. His teeth were bared now. I could feel the vibration of his growl through the ground. My hands finally started working again. Adrenaline flooded my system, snapping me out of that frozen shock. I reached back into the tent without taking my eyes off the man and grabbed the bear spray. The can felt like a lifeline in my palm. Rocky continued pacing side to side, blocking every possible angle the man could approach from. The stranger's eyes flicked between me and the dog, calculating. Then, without a word, he turned and ran. He disappeared into the darkness almost instantly, branches snapping and leaves crunching as he vanished between the trees. I stood there shaking, the bear spray raised, listening. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. Nothing. No footsteps returning, no movement, no sound besides Rocky's heavy breathing and the faint crackle of the dying fire. I didn't wait. I started tearing the camp down immediately. My hands moved fast and sloppy, stuffing gear into the pack, collapsing the tent, shoving everything inside without caring about order. Rocky circled the clearing non-stop, ears up, scanning the tree line like a sentry. Every shadow felt like movement. Every snap of a twig made my heart jump. Within minutes, the campsite looked abandoned. I shouldered the pack, clipped Rocky's leash on for the first time that entire trip, and started down the trail. We moved fast, not running, conserving energy, but never slowing. Even with the adrenaline still pumping through me, a strange calm settled in. Rocky had reacted perfectly. He'd warned me early. He'd stood his ground. He'd given me the seconds I needed to protect myself. Without him, I honestly don't know how that encounter would have ended. The hike back felt endless. Dark trees crowded in from both sides of the trail, the beam of my flashlight slicing a narrow tunnel through the blackness. Every now and then I'd stop and listen, convinced I'd hear footsteps behind us. I never did. We reached the trailhead just before sunrise. The sky was barely starting to lighten, turning the horizon a dull gray. My legs ached. My throat felt dry and raw from stress and cold air. I loaded my pack into the car, helped Rocky into the back seat, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. We were safe. Later that day, I reported what happened as best as I could. Location, description, timeline. But the area was remote, with no cameras, no witnesses, and no real leads. I wasn't surprised when nothing came of it. The forest keeps its secrets. I've been on many camping trips since then. Rocky's still the same happy, fearless dog he's always been, chasing scents, exploring trails, living his best life in the wild. But now, I trust his instincts more than my own. If he senses something is wrong, I don't question it anymore. I leave. Because that night taught me something I'll never forget. Sometimes the danger isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come crashing through the trees. Sometimes it waits quietly in the dark, until you're close enough to touch. Next story. I didn't realize how close I came to dying that night until I replayed the moment in my head later, over and over again. Not when I heard footsteps moving through the dark. Not when I saw a stranger watching me from the trees. Not even when his hands reached out toward my chest. It was when I felt the empty space behind my heels and understood that one more step backward would have sent me over the edge of a mountain. It was late fall, just before winter settled into Montana. I had driven out to a popular overlook just outside Glacier National Park. Not inside the park itself, but close enough that on a clear day you could see the ridges stretching endlessly across the horizon. The trail wasn't regulated, no rangers, no permits, no crowds this time of year. That was exactly why I went. Most people had already packed up their gear for the season, and I didn't mind the cold. I wanted the quiet, the isolation, the feeling that the entire mountain belonged only to me for a night. The hike up took nearly 6 hours. By the time I reached the top, the sun was already drifting toward the horizon, painting the valley below in long orange shadows. The summit opened into a wide grassy clearing, dotted with a few old stone fire rings where hikers sometimes camped. Beyond that, A jagged stone ledge pushed outward, overlooking miles of forest and distant peaks. I dropped my pack near the closest fire ring, cooked a simple dinner, and carried my chair over to the edge of the overlook. The drop below was steep enough that looking straight down made my stomach tighten, but the view was worth it. The mountains layered into the distance like fading silhouettes. The sky burned slowly from orange into purple and deep blue. For almost half an hour, I forgot everything else existed. No phones, no people, no noise except wind brushing across the valley. When the last light finally disappeared beyond the horizon, I stood up and turned back toward camp. And that's when I saw him. A man was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, half hidden inside the bushes where the forest began. He was watching me. I couldn't make out his face clearly in the fading light, only the outline of a body, still and upright, angled directly toward me. The moment our eyes met, he turned away and disappeared into the trees. No hesitation, no reaction, just gone. A cold ripple passed through my chest. At first, I told myself he was probably another hiker who'd arrived late and already set up somewhere deeper in the clearing. From where I'd been sitting, I could only see my own gear, not the far side of the campsite. Still, something about how quickly he vanished bothered me. When I walked back toward my campfire ring, I scanned the area carefully. No tent, no backpack, no headlamp glow, no movement. And the direction he had vanished into wasn't even toward the campsites. It was straight into dense trees. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing but wind and distant forest sounds. I forced myself to shake it off. I stacked dry sticks into the stone circle, lit the fire, unfolded my chair, and sat down, trying to settle back into the calm of the evening. But the feeling never fully left. Time stretched quietly. The fire crackled. The cold crept in slowly. Around 11 p.m., I heard it. Footsteps, not branches snapping randomly, not animals rustling. Footsteps, deliberate, paced, moving somewhere just beyond the edge of the light. I leaned forward in my chair, listening carefully. Step, pause, step, too even, too controlled. I called out into the darkness. "Hey, is someone out there?" The steps stopped. Silence pressed in so thick I could hear my own breathing. A few seconds passed. Then the footsteps started again, moving away this time, deeper into the trees. No reply, no voice. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or elk moving through brush, but deep down, I knew how different human movement sounded in the woods. Still, who would be hiking around here this late? Eventually, the sound faded completely. I stayed awake much longer than I expected after that, staring into the fire, replaying the sound in my head. Midnight came and went, and sleep never came close. Restless and bored, I decided to walk back to the overlook and see if the moon had cleared the clouds. I left the fire burning and walked slowly toward the cliff edge. Moonlight washed over the valley below, silvering the tops of distant ridges. A light breeze moved through the grass and trees, carrying that hollow nighttime silence that only mountains seem to have. I stood there for maybe a minute, when suddenly, several branches snapped violently behind me. A bush exploded with movement. I spun around. The same man stepped out of the trees, but this time he didn't turn away. He stepped out of the darkness slowly, branches scraping